So I'm thinking about how it is that migrants conceptualize themselves as African away from the continent, and how that is affected by the stereotypes about, or like ideas about Africa that exist outside of the continent.
Hello everyone. Welcome back to part 2 of my interview with Augusta Atinuke Irele. On part 1, we talked about her life growing up in different places in the US, what it means to have Africans parents at home, and all the way from high school to work to getting back to school, pursuing her Ph.D. at the moment. And her current focus for a PhD is Africana Studies, Comparative Literature, and Literary Theory. So without further ado, Augusta, the first question I have for you here is just tell us about your life as a PhD in literature. Happiness, joys, frustration, everything. Just let us know.
I still, today at least, I woke up still feeling grateful that this is my life. My job is to read interesting books about Africans and to write about them, which I think is awesome. I'm in the stage where I'm writing my dissertation full time, so I'm no longer taking classes and I'm no longer teaching anymore. Mm-hmm. I enjoyed classes. The thing that was interesting to me, though, is that a lot of the classes were about kind of the whims and the interests of the professor. And so I ended up taking some interesting classes and reading some things that I would never have read, had I been left to my own devices, for better or for worse, right? There's some things that I read that absolutely helped me and changed and, made a deep impact. And there's some things that I read that I wish I could get those hours back. But my day-to-day now, usually, I'll get up and I try to read in the morning and write in the afternoon, because I know that my brain doesn't really turn on analytically until about 1 p.m., really. And this was true when I was working too. I would be a zombie until about lunchtime. So that's what I'm trying to protect, like the afternoon hours as my writing hours, because that's when I feel that I can be most productive. And I try to use, like a 10 to 7 kind of work day and really force myself to stop working, right, in the evening and go do other things. I started teaching myself how to crochet, and so then I'll watch like terrible TV and crochet a blanket. But, I think the thing about academia that is different from, not different, but it has a different pace than office life. And so you can stay at the office all day. You can stay at the office all night, right? Most of my work in academia I could do at home. And so, especially in the first few years, I was working at home, reading, doing coursework, all those things, and then writing whatever I needed to write, and was going from about 10 a.m. to about 2 a.m., right? And then just doing that. And that's not really sustainable, nor is that healthy. So I have tried to mimic as much as possible an office job kind of hours so that I am keeping my sanity, because academia in a lot of ways could be all consuming and could be all that people identify as. And I am adamant for that to not be my only kind of identity marker as this PhD. It's not going to take over my whole life. It can't.
I see. Making sure that it's part of who you are, but that's not everything.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
What's the structure of a PhD in literature? So again, I really don't know. Is there a set amount of years that when you get in 2015, you're supposed to be done by 2020? Because you say that at the moment you stop taking classes, you're focusing on your thesis. So I'm guessing that at the beginning there are, I guess, a bunch of classes that you have to take that are considered the basis. And after a specific amount of time, it's up to you to know, based on everything you've seen so far, what you want to focus on. And then it's up to you to basically drive yourself for the duration of time that you want until the end. Like, how does that process work?
Yeah, so the way that it works here, there are variables across different kind of schools and programs, but the way that it works here is that my program, comparative literature, actually both, in Africana Studies, are really coursework heavy. And so we had essentially 3 years of coursework requirements, right? For us, it was units. So it's like you have to take 20 units, right? And each class is 1 unit. Mm-hmm. And over the course of those classes, you're fulfilling requirements for the department. So there are some what they call pro seminars, and I think different schools will call them something different, that are designed to give you the theoretical base to be able to know the basics and know what you're talking about as an academic in your field, regardless of what your specialization is. You should have read these theoretical texts. You should have read these kind of foundational texts, and you should be comfortable enough to talk about them and cite them. Along the way, there are also exams. And so oral and written exams, all of my exams had kind of both components, oral and written, where you select your committee of 3 faculty members, and they can ask you any question about any text that's on a list.
Wow.
Because I'm in 2 departments, I took twice the exams, which was awful. But yeah, so I mean, I ended up taking an exam, at least an exam, in some cases 2 exams every year of my first few years in my departments. And that, again, is supposed to test expertise. I think it's really a holdover from the European system, because I don't really know that there's an instance as an academic that I would have to have that kind of recall anyway, like as a practicing academic. But, you do it. It's one of those obstacles that you do. And then there is what's called basically a comprehensive or a qualifying exam, and that would be it coincides with the end of coursework, and that's when you demonstrate that you've reached a certain level of kind of expertise to be able to move into doing your own research. In literature, because I do contemporary literature, I don't need to go and travel or sit in archives. Depending on the time of the people that's studying, there's some folks who will need to go to different parts of the world and sit and start to dig and find these kinds of like older materials or all that stuff. I'm lucky enough that with contemporary literature, and now that Africa is like so fashionable, I don't really have much of a problem finding what I need to find. So what I did last year, 2 years ago, was research to develop a proposal of my dissertation, which is essentially what's going to turn into the introduction. So I wrote a 40-page proposal that I submitted to my dissertation committee, 4 faculty members who I chose and asked to be on my committee. Those 4 have agreed to be on my committee, which means mentoring me, but also providing me feedback along the way as I write my project. And they're the ones who will decide whether I'm ready to graduate.
So just so I know, I make sure I understand it correctly. So the 40-page is basically telling them this is what I want to write about, yes, and why. And you need 40 pages. Jesus, okay, that's a lot of.
And that's low. I mean, there are some people who write much longer, and anthropology, like in other fields, you have to do a lot more. But what in that prospectus, you have to basically draw. What theoretical kind of timeline are you fitting in? What is your question, your research question? Why is it important? And based off of your kind of theoretical and preliminary research, how are you going to go about answering this question? And so At the end, you break down what are the chapters of your dissertation? What are they about? What question does each chapter of your dissertation address? The interesting thing about that is it's a practice. I mean, people do it for all kinds, it's an application tool, right? So you have to constantly propose these kinds of things, knowing full well, even at the outset, everybody tells you that the prospectus is a fiction. So you're writing this thing that's not actually going to turn to be your dissertation. That was a very trying time of this journey, when I knew that I was doing this thing just because it's a thing that you do, and not that it's like a roadmap that I'm actually going to follow very closely.
I see.
But I do push myself to come back to it, because there's some theoretical and there's some research that I did to prepare that prospectus that is still helpful and is still foundational for how I'm writing, even if I have shifted some of my chapters a little bit and dropped chapters entirely. And so now I'm writing, and the average, it typically takes people in literature 2 to 3 years to write a dissertation. So I just finished year 1 of writing very slowly, and I think I have 2 more years of work to do. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. Now that you explain what the idea behind the 40 pages is supposed to be a guideline for you. So in theory, if the subject remains the same, you already have a game plan, basically of 40 pages that you're just supposed to work. So even if you switch, as you say, it's still very helpful, because just the process and the how to do it, you already taken the time to lay that down. Okay, that's cool. I think that's a good segue into our next question, and specifically, how do you approach then now that you are actively into the creative part of your PhD where you have to write your thesis? So how do you approach it? What type of routine do you follow before selecting or reading a new book? Yeah, you have a big team. You can break it down, I guess, in a lot of subsequent team. But yeah, what's the step that you follow from I need to read a book to that's the book I want to read? And when I'm reading the book, how exactly, what does that look like? Are you sitting at a Starbucks just reading until 1 p.m. and just stop? Are you taking notes every 5 minutes? Like, walk us through that.
Yeah. So my process, for reading books, so what I try to do is stay up to date on kind of like literature blogs. And so there are lots of, people are writing from the continent, about the continent. There's lots. It's a very productive time right now. So I try to stay up to date on literature blogs. Some of the books that come out, from the description of them, or like the excerpts that I read, might already touch on a theme that I've already addressed, and so I don't read them necessarily. Like, I'll earmark them and put them on a list of things that I want to read eventually because I should know, right? I should have a sense of what's going on in the scene. Right now, I'm trying to stay hyper-focused on the text that I have identified as part of my dissertation. Some of them it's just because I liked them. Some of them it's because they asked interesting questions or portrayed another side. One of the books, Behold the Dreamers by Mbolo Mbue, is about this Cameroonian family that migrates to New York. And it's tough for them. It's like, New York sucks, right, for these people. And eventually they're like, maybe we should go back. And that, to me, as an immigrant story, it's a non-traditional story. It's not the one of, like, the people who come with their Ghana must go bags and they stay and they make it, right? Mm-hmm. They come and they find that it's very, very difficult, and they're questioning the choice to move to the West and are imagining Cameroon now as a utopia, right, where they can achieve more than they could in New York City. That was interesting to me because it's a reversal of a typical migrant narrative. Mm-hmm. And so I picked it, right? So some of it is like not a science.
Quick question there. Sorry to interrupt you, but that discovery process, is it that you've heard of her before and Behold the Dreams and you know it's something that could complement your work? So the discovery process, do you know about her work and then you're trying to see how it can help, or do you know her name and it's okay, let's look at what she has done? I'm seeing this as
like a funnel.
Like a funnel, exactly. So how does that comes from, I don't know, 25, 30 things that you look at to, okay, it's her, it's that book, it's that passage?
This is her first book, so I didn't know about her before I picked this one. I believe, to be honest with you, that I stumbled upon this book when I was compiling the list for one of my exams. Mm-hmm. One of my qualifying exams, and I read it, and I found it because I honestly think I did like a blog search or like a Google search of like, okay. African literature. Because, all of these blogs are like, here are the top 5 women that you should be reading right now from the continent, right? All those things. They're stupid, but they're very helpful, for me to be like, okay, so who are people talking about, right? Like, who's garnering public attention? Because academia, at the end of the day, has to follow public interest. Otherwise, nobody's going to... people aren't buying our books, but people are definitely not going to buy our books if we're writing about people that no one cares about, right? Sure. And she was selected, New York Times bestseller, and she was the book of the year for the New York Public Library, and I think she got like $1 million advance, which is unheard of for a person who's never written a book before, right? Mm-hmm. So... she was making waves and continues to. She's still going on her book circuit, and it's like 3 years after she's published this book, she's still touring off of this one text. You kind of have to, as an academic, hitch your wagon to someone else's star, right? As an academic, and this is a star that I think she's not obnoxious yet, and so I'm okay with, following her work, and it's really good. It's really interesting. There are other things, there's some texts that are more obvious for the question that I'm asking about, African migrants, that on the flip side, everybody is writing about Chimamanda Adichie's Americana, so she's not in my dissertation because I don't think I need to just be like screaming into that very congested area. That book is very interesting, and I think there's going to be a movie or a TV series coming out soon with Lupita in it, right? Like again, like she's very famous. She was on the Beyonce song, whatever. People have done that already, and so I'm allowing those people to continue to do that, and I'm choosing to, choose a different direction. And there are a few books like that, and so I'm just constantly balancing. One, is this a book that I enjoy enough to read it 3-4 more times? I'm going to be talking about this book for the next 10 years, right? Until my book comes out. The dissertation eventually becomes the book that you publish, your first book that you publish, ideally, as an academic, which means that I'm going to keep tinkering with this project.
So you really need to love it.
Yeah. Yes, for the next, once I graduate, that's fine. It's the dissertation, but then you have to turn it into a book once you become a professor, and that's different. And maybe I add a chapter, I take some chapters out. So I'm going to keep thinking about these things for years, and this is a text that I have a feeling, and I may be wrong, but I have a feeling I'm not going to get sick of. Right. And by that time, it has there are enough themes in these texts that I've selected that I can continue to be productive and continue to think about them 10 years into the future. And it's not just a fad that's going to disappear. So, yeah, so, there's a balance. And then there are lots of books that I buy on Amazon that are sitting on my shelves that I should read and I haven't, or I read a chapter and or sometimes I read a chapter, skip a chapter. But in terms of my kind of process as I'm reading, I annotate, I usually sit with a highlighter and a pen and annotate in the text. I like to read the physical books first, and then translate those to digital. I use OneNote, but translate those notes over to digital so that I can search them when I'm, if I have to teach them or something kind of down the line. But I'm a very active reader, and I can't read in Starbucks. I can't read when people are talking, so I usually just listen to it's terrible, New Orleans jazz or classical music or awful EDM that's all electronic and no words at all.
So you listen to that as you read?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
It doesn't phase you out of the reading at all?
It takes care of my subconscious. I think a lot, so if I'm thinking too much, it pulls me away from the text. So I need something noise in the background that's just instrumental to take care of that kind of subconscious, all these other things that I need to take care of. It's while I'm a PhD student, I'm also an adult with bills to pay and, things going on in family and the world is falling apart, right? And so there are all these things that I need to do to distract my brain from thinking about those things. So usually, music, I play music while I'm reading. And then I write my little notes. Mm-hmm.
Got it. So we talked about the selection process. We talked about your routine as you read, writing inside, taking notes. So I'm guessing after, is it a compilation of your notes? Is it getting back to some pages and see how they fit into your team? What exactly happens once you're done?
Yeah. So as I'm taking notes, I also earmark. It's terrible. People who love books hate that I do this, but I fold down the corner of the books.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's killing me right now, but go on.
I know my mom's a librarian, and I can't tell her that this is what I do to my book. But those are usually passages that I think would be important to pull out and analyze in my writing. And so once I have finished the text, I'll go back and type those in a Word document, all of them. I just go through and type all of them. And then my process is then to go in and fill in my own analysis. And sometimes if I've already addressed a question, then I'll just take some of the quotes that I've pulled out and I'll just put them in another. I always, whenever I'm writing, I have just this a Word document that's just called fragments, where I just put all the quotes that I haven't used. I don't delete. I just put things that I've written, quotes that I haven't used in another document, because I may need them if I'm writing something else down the line, or a conference paper or something. So that's my writing process, and then I just kind of chug along and write. And every day when I sit down, I try to identify a writing goal or a section that I want to work on, so that I'm not just sitting and staring at the cursor, just blinking and taunting me every day as I continue to write very slowly.
Got it. That works. Before we get to a very live application of that, I just want you quickly to remind us the full title of your thesis, so that people can see the next passages that you're going to present to us, how exactly it fits into your work.
Yeah, so the dissertation chapter is in flux, or the dissertation title is in flux, but right now I think I'm calling it Idioscapes of Africa, Diaspora and the Contemporary African Imagination. So I'm thinking about how it is that migrants conceptualize themselves as African away from the continent, and how that is affected by the stereotypes about, or like ideas about Africa that exist outside of the continent. So it's a very, very brief nutshell of what this dissertation does, but each chapter kind of takes on a different kind of component of how how migrants run up against what it means to be of a place in another place that they're also trying to understand.
I see. And from that, we can see how that goal is coming both from your personal experience, your parents, or what you've been used to see. So yeah, now I'm excited to see which passage you have for us. So just for our listeners, the goal will be for Augusta to read that passage and just tell us about what she thinks, what she makes of what she's reading, and how is that fitting into her work.
So I have this text by this woman named Shailja Patel. It was published in 2010. It's called Migritude. And it was originally kind of a traveling one-woman show that she then published in 2010. She herself is of South Asian descent and grew up in Kenya. And so now she kind of bounces back and forth between California and Nairobi primarily. But so she's thinking about belonging and migritude. She calls migritude like migrants with attitude, right? And basing it a lot on like some of Aimé Césaire's stuff. But what it means to be of all of these different places.
Got it.
So the passage that I'm thinking about is from a chapter in Migritude that's called Dreaming in Gujarati. She's talking about her father who speaks 5 languages, right? Urdu, Hindi, Punjabi, Swahili, Arabic, and Gujarati. So she says, 5 languages, 5 different worlds, yet English shrinks him down before white men who think their flat, cold, spiky words make the only reality. And then later on she says, if we cannot name it, does it exist? What becomes of a tongue of milk-heavy cows, earthen pots, jingling anklets, temple bells, when its children grow up in Silicon Valley to be programmers? So, what is interesting to me about this is, first of all, the question of language, and I think this is one that we think about a lot as African migrant. Are there parts of ourselves that are only expressible in one particular language? Or are there parts of ourselves that are never expressible? We're never able to fully address or represent in English, right? What does living in the U.S., living in the West, growing up in Silicon Valley, right, as somebody who dreams maybe in Gujarati or in another language or is used to kind of switching codes in that way, what relationship do you have to all these different languages? The other thing, right, when she talks about her father, he speaks 5 languages, and each of those languages she describes as 5 different worlds, because each language comes with its own set of values and set of reading the world. And so he speaks all these different languages, yet English, this one language, is colonial kind of, and obviously, right, there's this colonial residue, shrinks him down before white men specifically, who think their flat, cold, spiky words make the only reality. And it speaks to kind of these like global hierarchies, right? Where if we are not able, I was talking about this with my parents, there are different registers of English even, right? And so English tinged with an accent automatically conveys, it portrays a particular image of you as a person to people who, you are also, for you too, like you are a native French speaker, but you speak French with an African accent. That's different, right? To somebody when you encounter them in Paris. My father was the same, not native French speaker, but spoke French fluently with his African accent, right? His Nigerian accent of all things too, which is like a whole other kind of French. And so when you're interacting with people in those languages, there are all kinds of assumptions, there are all kinds of worlds and all kinds of ideas that accompany their perceptions of you, and that then define how you're performing your own self and belonging, right? And one of the words that I use a lot in my dissertation is this idea of unbelonging as an identity, like someone being able to be rooted in an identity of not belonging in the place where they reside. It's really powerful when you know that you can speak all these other languages, but there's no use to speaking Gujarati and Arabic in Silicon Valley, right? You have to speak English. And so what happens when that language dies culturally, when that's not the form of expression that you can use primarily? I think it's a really complex and profound question, and she doesn't provide any answers, and I definitely will not be providing answers in my dissertation, but I think it's something, and it's what I appreciate about her is that she is African, right? She grew up in Kenya. Her family is of a generation of folks who were forced out of their native land to Kenya, right, as part of colonial projects. And so they're from South Asia. She's ethnically South Asian. And so there are all kinds of migrant histories that she carries already. And then she makes the choice to emigrate to the US. So all of that combines into her thinking of really residing in her what she calls migritude as a state of existence, right? Not just like I happen to be a migrant, but I will forever be a migrant, right? I'm forever in this lineage of migrants, regardless of whether I grew up in Silicon Valley or not. I think that resonates for a lot of us who are children of immigrants. I always say my primary identity marker is child of immigrant, right? I grew up in the US, that's fine, and I sound American. But there's something about being part of this immigration, this migrant experience that colors your world, right? And it affects how you interact with everybody.
Definitely. So, and it's interesting because there is first of all, thank you for sharing that passage with us. I definitely do appreciate it. It's interesting because as you were speaking, I feel like there's so many directions that your dissertation can take, right? You mentioned the idea of the languages and the way we express ourselves in different languages, like things that you say much more easily in French than in English or in Portuguese for this or that reason. So that is not a complete dissertation, I feel, right? Like at which point, how do you set boundaries into your work? Do you limit yourself to talk about that specific thing in a chapter? Yeah. Because otherwise you never stop say, oh wow, language and culture, where did this start? Yeah. Where's the intersection? So how do you set those boundaries for yourself?
My committee tells me it's too much. I think I think the thing is, I always have to remind myself because, there are all these questions, and language is not really. It comes up in one of my chapters, but it's not. You're right. I could write a whole other dissertation about migrant language, right, and what that means. So how do I set the limits on what I write? Part of it is just, I know that this is the first of what's going to be a longer project. And so there's some questions that I know are outside of the scope of this dissertation because I need to just write it and graduate. Dissertation chapters, my advisor was like, aim for 50 pages. So anything that's outside of 50 pages, save it for later, or write it in an article somewhere else. But two, what I constantly am trying to come back to is what is the question of this chapter? And does this address the question of this chapter? And if it doesn't, it's not part of this project. And it can show up somewhere else, or it's someone else's question, right? And that just doesn't have to be me, or I can raise it when I'm teaching the book and not necessarily when I'm writing about it. And so those are the things that, as I go through, I'm trying to outline so that I can be clear about what my moves are and what I'm making, or what point I'm making, at each specific juncture, so that I don't get carried away with all these other things. And that's not to say it doesn't happen. I sent a draft to my committee a few weeks ago of a chapter, and they told me to cut out a full 20 pages. So I ramble and include things all the time. And that's, kind of the job of the committee to say, yeah, maybe not this right now. Maybe some other time, or maybe never. Please don't.
But as you say, it's not necessarily lost because it can be part of an eventual second book, right? Looking back at what you've done before with a new and mature look at the research you've done a couple of years prior, it can still be material for a different... Okay.
Right.
That sounds good. Before the interview, Augusta, I asked you about... a couple of authors that I should check out to make sure I can relate to what you're saying. So you told me about Imbolo Mboe, which is a Cameroonian who wrote Behold the Dreamers. We talked about her earlier. And another one was Gino Mengetsu, Ethiopian American, who I think moved to the US when he was 2 years old, very young. So you talked about Imbolo already. How about, what about him or his work do you like and you think was worthy to include into your dissertation?
Well, he's written 3 books. I'm focusing on his first one called The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears, mainly because the main character is like so melancholic that he ends up just kind of wandering. Like he goes off on these like long walks, aimless walks, and he's like meditating on what he has lost in Ethiopia and what he's trying to do and build in the US. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something in there about that figure of the wanderer, right? The wandering dreamer, the wandering thinker. That's really interesting. Partly because when you think about, and they did this to us, and during colonialism and colonization, that in order to be considered a cosmopolitan or sophisticated, you have to fit into the metropole. And in the case of colonialism, it was London or Paris, right? Mm-hmm. Primarily for us. And so this book is set mostly in Washington, D.C., and he's almost the anti-cosmopolitan because he's wandering. He's doing this thing, the flaneur thing, right? Where like you are demonstrating your thoughtfulness and your philosophical sophistication by being able to move around the city. But he's doing it because he feels so unrooted by his migration. He's a refugee, so it was forced migration. He had to leave during the during the Derg in Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. That he cannot reestablish roots in the U.S. because his déracinement, his like unrootedness is the word that I use, but it doesn't actually work in English. It works much better in French. We were talking about language earlier, but it's like he was arraché, he was ripped, he was torn from his life in Ethiopia in such a violent and traumatic way that it prevents him from being able to kind of feel settled. And so that's what sets off his wandering around D.C., the capital of the U.S., is like there's this melancholy, this kind of layered belonging that's never fully of any place. He cannot go back to Ethiopia because of the conditions, right, that caused him to leave. And yet he's never going to feel truly settled in the U.S. And he's part of this group of one Kenyan and a Congolese man, this trio of people who are ruminating on what it means to be African, how to be successful, how to recreate a life in DC when it's impossible to kind of go back for various reasons.
Wow, we definitely are going to take some time in the part 3 to talk about that idea of identity if you're not living on the continent and as part of the diaspora, get to know how you do define being African or of African descent. To close up this part, Augusta, I would just, for many of our listeners, including myself, who are Africans or friends of Africa, want to learn more about the continent. I think most of us probably are aware, as we talked recently, about Chinua Achebe. There are 2 or 3 books that, as you grew up, you heard about that you should check out. I know it's probably going to be a tough question for you, but if I'm getting interested into African literature, what are the couple of books that you recommend everyone to check out? It doesn't have to be from the 70s, right? It can be contemporary. And it can even come from what you said at the PhD, what I consider like the basics that you're supposed to know. What do you recommend to those people thirsty of knowledge of African literature?
I skew heavily Western, West Africa, because, kind of training and where I'm from. But so I actually do think it's cliche, but I think Things Fall Apart is up there. I will add Eastern African, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, no longer a river between. Really, any Ngugi text is important. I think he should have won the Nobel Peace Prize by now. But I think he's a really important author for thinking about what it means to be kind of authentically post-colonially African, right? And really thinking about how to negotiate between all of these different moments of belonging. So he's written quite a few, but the one that I would really recommend is from 1965. It's called The River Between, and that centers on education, kind of a good parallel for Things Fall Apart. In terms of contemporary, I would say women, Mariam Abbas, So Long a Letter, Une si longue lettre, is originally published in French and then translated. And then contemporary, I think I do think anything by Chimamanda Adichie. I think Half a Yellow Sun was really strong and talked about it's about the Nigerian Civil War in the 60s. And then if I were to say one more, it actually would be actually a Tanzanian author, No Violet Bulawayo. It's called We Need New Names. That would be my long, far-reaching. I went from the 60s until to 2016 in 5 books, but those would be the ones that I would recommend for beginners.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much for that, Augusta. And for our listeners, I'm pretty sure any type of literature, including African literature, it's very difficult in just 30, 45 minutes to cover everything. So the goal was to understand a bit more what Augusta is doing, what she's writing about, her focus in Africa, what she thinks of literatures in general. And as you can hear at the end, a couple of recommendations for a lot of us who might be interested to learn more or just read more about a continent but have no idea where to start, either because we're stuck in the past with recommendations from the 80s or don't know at all where to look. Being a Ph.D. in literature, focus on Africa, I'm pretty sure that her advice is worth it and definitely appreciated. So thank you very much for that, Augusta. I recommend our listeners to stick with us for the part 3. We're going to talk a lot more about Africa, talk about literature in Africa, but from a different point of view, looking at how we consume media nowadays. We are reading a lot less, so from her point of view, being a PhD in literature, what her thoughts are about it, and just end up with a funny, fancy firing round at the end. So thank you for listening so far. Talaku to you, and talk to you on part 3.